Hurry up, my dinner is getting cold. Madison snapped across the crowded ballroom, and every head turned toward Connor, the quiet maintenance man in a faded uniform. He did not apologize or look away. Connor set a scorched gas valve down on the table and said calmly, "Dinner is cold because I shut off the gas line. If I had been 90 seconds slower, everyone in this room would be dead." The ballroom fell silent. Then the alarm began to scream, and Connor realized the leak behind him was never an accident. It was murder, planned from inside the company. Stay until the very end to watch Connor save Madison and expose the traitor hiding inside her own trusted company. The story began on a bitter winter evening at the Grand Meridian Hotel, where more than 300 executives, investors, and city officials had gathered in the grand ballroom to celebrate a deal that would change the skyline of the city. Chandeliers threw warm light across marble floors, and waiters moved between tables carrying trays of champagne, while outside the wind pressed hard against the tall windows. Connor Hayes arrived for his shift the way he always did, quietly, carrying a worn toolbox and a face that betrayed nothing. Before he clocked in, he stepped into the maintenance corridor and made a short call to the babysitter watching his daughter. He promised he would be home before midnight, told her to lock the door behind her, and then slipped the phone into his pocket and became, once again, just another uniform in the building. Connor had not always been a maintenance technician. Years earlier, he had worked as a fire investigation engineer and a fuel systems safety specialist for the military, a career built on precision, patience, and the ability to read danger before anyone else could see it. After his wife died, he walked away from that dangerous life, choosing something quieter, something that would let him tuck his daughter into bed most nights instead of flying across the country toward the next disaster. Now he checked boilers instead of battlefields, and the men in expensive suits who passed him in the hallway rarely looked at him twice. To them he was simply part of the building, no different from the carpet or the light fixtures, present but invisible. While inspecting the kitchen systems before the event began, Connor noticed something wrong with the gas line pressure. The readings flickered in a pattern he did not like, rising and falling without any clear cause, and a sensor that had been replaced only weeks earlier was failing to send its warnings back to the control room the way it should. He reported the discrepancy to David Collins, the head manager of the Grand Meridian, but David waved him off without even looking up from his clipboard. David told him he was overreacting, that a party of this size could not afford any disruption, and that Connor should focus on keeping the kitchen running smoothly rather than chasing shadows in the pipes. In the ballroom above, Madison Carter stood near the stage rehearsing her opening remarks under her breath. As chief executive of Carter Hospitality Group, she carried the weight of the evening on her shoulders, because tonight she was expected to announce the largest acquisition of her career, the purchase of the very hotel hosting the celebration. Her board of directors had made it clear that the deal needed to close without a single misstep. Jason Walker, her chief financial officer, stayed close at her side, reminding her every few minutes that any disruption, however small, could send nervous investors running before the ink dried on the contract. His voice was calm, his smile practiced, and nothing in his manner suggested the truth hidden beneath his tailored suit. Back in the kitchen, Connor continued his inspection and caught the sharp scent of overheated metal near the pipeline feeding the main kitchen. Years of training told him this was not an ordinary malfunction, and something cold settled in his chest as he watched the pressure gauge spike and then plummet without warning, a signal that gas was being diverted somewhere it should never go, somewhere directly beneath the crowded ballroom above. Connor made a decision that would upend the entire evening. He ordered the kitchen staff to shut down every burner and evacuate the back-of-house area immediately, halting hundreds of plated dinners in the middle of preparation. Trays of food sat abandoned on steel counters, while confused servers gathered near the exits, unsure whether to laugh or panic. Out in the ballroom, Madison waited at the head table for her main course, tapping her fingers against the white linen while the minutes stretched past. Jason leaned toward her and murmured that the staff seemed disorganized tonight, planting a small seed of irritation that would soon grow into something far larger. David pulled Connor aside and marched him toward the head table, demanding he explain himself in front of Madison. Rather than admitting the truth about the pressure readings, David deflected blame entirely onto Connor, claiming the technician had shut down the gas system over nothing more than a faulty sensor and a hunch. Madison had spent the entire day fielding tense calls from her board, and the stress had worn her patience thin long before dinner ever began. Surrounded by investors watching her carefully planned evening fall apart over what sounded like an overcautious employee, she lost her composure completely. "Hurry up, my dinner is getting cold," she snapped, her voice cutting sharply across the ballroom. The room fell into an uncomfortable hush. A few guests near the front exchanged amused glances at the sight of Connor standing there in his faded work uniform, clearly out of place among the tailored suits and evening gowns. Connor did not raise his voice, and he did not defend his pride. He simply walked toward Madison's table and set down a scorched, misshapen valve he had removed from the kitchen line, only minutes earlier, the metal still faintly warm. He told her plainly that dinner was cold because he had shut off the gas line himself, and that if he had been even 90 seconds slower, a single spark from the warming equipment could have ignited the entire ballroom. He said it without anger, the way a man states a fact he has already accepted. The smirks around the room disappeared instantly. At that exact moment, an alarm tore through the building. The lights flickered and dimmed, the fire doors along the perimeter slammed shut and locked automatically, and the ventilation system shuddered to a stop, leaving the air suddenly still and heavy. Connor's eyes moved quickly across the room, calculating, and a cold certainty settled over him. Someone inside the building had just triggered an emergency lockdown manually, from a control point that should have required clearance far above his own, and the timing was far too precise to be coincidence. Guests near the tall windows began murmuring nervously, some reaching for phones only to find the signal blocked, others rising from their chairs as though instinct alone might carry them somewhere safer. Security staff near the main doors looked at one another, waiting for instructions nobody seemed prepared to give. Madison rose from her seat, her earlier irritation replaced by something closer to fear, though she fought to keep her expression composed for the sake of the investors watching her every move. She looked at Connor, the man she had humiliated only moments earlier, and for the first time that evening she seemed uncertain of who was truly in control of the room. Connor raised his voice just enough to be heard across the ballroom, instructing everyone to keep their phones off, avoid touching any switches, and under no circumstances use a lighter or match. He explained as calmly as he could manage that gas may have collected in the hollow spaces beneath the floor, and that a single spark anywhere in the room could ignite it. Madison remained skeptical at first, still shaken by the humiliation of the evening but unwilling to hand control to a maintenance worker in front of her guests. When a staff member arrived with a handheld gas detector, however, the reading climbed so fast that her skepticism collapsed within seconds. Panic rippled through the crowd. Several guests rushed toward the exit doors, only to find them locked tight by the emergency system, and their frustration quickly turned to fear. Connor was forced to shout above the noise, warning that any crush of bodies near the electrical panels could knock something loose or spark a current that would end the night for everyone. He climbed into the narrow technical crawlspace beneath the stage platform, searching for a second shutoff valve buried deep in the mechanical framework. In the tight, dust-filled darkness, his flashlight caught something that made his stomach turn, a sensor wire that had been deliberately severed with a precision tool, the cut clean and unmistakably intentional. This was no accident. While Connor worked to seal the line by hand, a small electronic timer nearby began to glow with a soft red light near the control box for the ventilation fan. The device had been built to trigger the fan motor within less than a minute, and the spark from that motor striking gas-heavy air could be enough to level the entire ballroom. There was no time left to disassemble the device properly. Connor grabbed a wrench, smashed open the electrical housing, and tore the main fuse out with his bare hands, plunging the entire ballroom into complete darkness. For a few agonizing seconds, nobody in the room knew whether an explosion was still coming. Then the emergency lights flickered on. The gas readings on the handheld detector began to fall. Connor had stopped the first disaster. Madison noticed the burns already forming across his palm, but he brushed off her concern, telling her flatly that the danger was far from over because whoever had sabotaged the system was still somewhere inside the hotel. Amelia Reed, the operations director, hurried over with a tablet showing the security log, and her face went pale as she read it aloud. The emergency lockdown had been triggered using Connor's own employee access card. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward him at once. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd, and the warmth some guests had briefly felt toward the man who had just saved their lives curdled into suspicion. It was easier, perhaps, to imagine a stranger in a work uniform as a threat than to imagine one of their own polished colleagues capable of such a thing. Connor said nothing in his own defense at first. He simply looked at the tablet in Amelia's hands, studying the timestamp of the access log, running the sequence of events through his mind the way he once analyzed evidence at the site of a fire. Something about the timing did not add up, and he intended to find out exactly what. Jason wasted no time seizing the moment. He turned to the gathered crowd and asked, loudly enough for everyone to hear, why Connor's access card would appear in the lockdown log, and why the very man who first discovered the leak was also the one holding the evidence of it. David chimed in, revealing that Connor had once worked in a classified military role, though the specifics of that career remained sealed. The mention of secrecy was enough to plant deeper doubt among the guests, several of whom began murmuring that a man with a hidden past could easily have a hidden motive. Hotel security moved in and held Connor near the stage, while Madison, still rattled by fear and the pressure bearing down on her from every direction, ordered his tools confiscated until the police arrived to sort out the truth. Connor did not resist. Instead, he turned to Amelia and asked how long his access card had been out of his possession that evening. She thought back and remembered that Connor had left his jacket in the staff break room for roughly 10 minutes before the event began. Plenty of time for someone to slip the card free and either copy it or plant it elsewhere. He realized then that whoever sabotaged the system had either cloned his credentials or stolen the card outright to build a trail leading straight back to him. While the crowd's attention remained fixed on Connor, he caught the distant hum of a compressor starting up somewhere below the building, a machine tied to the backup fuel system that had no reason to activate with the main power already cut. He warned Madison that gas might be getting pumped toward another part of the building entirely. Jason dismissed the claim immediately, suggesting Connor was simply trying to redirect suspicion away from himself and toward some imaginary threat. Madison stood at the center of an impossible choice. She could trust the stranger who had just risked his own life to save the room, or she could trust the finance director who had stood beside her through 8 years of building the company from the ground up. In the end, she instructed security to hold Connor in the control room rather than release him to the police immediately, buying herself time to think clearly before making any irreversible decision. Connor studied the building schematics mounted on the control room wall and noticed the secondary gas line ran directly beneath the record storage room in the basement, the same room holding every document connected to the audit Madison had scheduled. If a fire started there, the evidence she needed would burn along with it. He told Madison plainly that the true target might not be her life alone. Whoever orchestrated this wanted the evidence destroyed and wanted him left holding the blame when the smoke cleared. Moments later, every basement camera feed went dark at once. Madison made a decision that surprised everyone around her. She agreed to give Connor a chance to prove what he was saying, sending Amelia down with him while 2 security guards followed closely behind, still wary of every move he made. The group descended into the basement using the emergency stairwell, since the elevators remained locked for safety. The air grew warmer with each flight, carrying a strange chemical odor that grew sharper the closer they came to the records room. Inside the room, Connor found industrial gas canisters hidden behind stacks of storage boxes, connected to the ventilation system through a length of temporary tubing that had clearly been installed in a hurry. What troubled him most was the design of the device. It had not been built to explode on contact. Instead, it was engineered to burn slowly, producing exactly the kind of gradual fire that would look like careless maintenance rather than deliberate sabotage. Near a sharp metal edge, Connor spotted a torn fragment of leather glove caught on the frame of the shelving unit. The material was far too fine for a standard maintenance uniform, matching instead the kind of premium accessory set given only to senior executives at Carter Hospitality Group. Amelia pulled up the maintenance records on her tablet and discovered that David had personally signed off on inspections that had never actually taken place. When confronted, David admitted, his voice shaking, that Jason had pressured him into signing the false reports so nothing would delay the acquisition. Connor was not yet convinced David was the true mastermind. His failures came from greed and cowardice, but the precision of this setup suggested someone who understood Madison's schedule, the audit process, and the company's financial systems far more intimately than a hotel manager ever could. At that moment, Jason appeared in the doorway of the basement, claiming he had come down to help. Connor's eyes moved immediately to the torn cuff of his jacket sleeve, a tear that lined up perfectly with the fragment of glove still resting in his palm. Before Connor could confront him directly, a fire alarm erupted from the floor above. Jason insisted Madison was in danger and urged everyone to return to the ballroom immediately, his voice carrying an urgency that felt just slightly too rehearsed. Connor suspected this might be a diversion designed to pull them away from the evidence. Still, when he called Madison's phone, all he heard was the sound of something striking metal before the line went dead. Madison was gone. Connor's mind raced back through every detail of the evening, the timing of the lockdown, the compressor firing in the basement, the fragment of glove pressed into his palm. All of it pointed toward a man who had spent years standing quietly beside Madison, trusted with every number the company produced, close enough to know exactly where and when to strike without ever raising suspicion. He turned to Amelia and told her to secure the records room and preserve everything they had found, because whatever happened next would need proof that could stand up in front of investigators. Then he moved toward the stairwell, his burned hand aching, his thoughts already racing ahead to wherever Madison might be. While Connor had been in the basement, Madison received a text message that appeared to come from the chairman of her board, instructing her to meet him privately in a second-floor conference room to discuss the timing of the announcement. The message had actually been sent by Jason using a spoofed number he had prepared days in advance. The moment Madison stepped into the service elevator, the system locked itself between the first and second floors. The ventilation fan inside the small cabin shut off entirely, while a thin stream of gas began seeping in through a narrow pipe fitted into the wall panel behind her. Jason wanted her death to look like a continuation of the original leak, one final tragic consequence of a building already in crisis. Connor emerged from the stairwell and immediately noticed Madison was nowhere in sight. He checked the nearest control panel and discovered that the service elevator had been manually disconnected from the central building system, isolated in a way that should have required a supervisor's override. Ignoring the objections of the security team still trailing him, Connor sprinted up to the second floor, pried open the elevator doors with a mechanical bar from his toolkit, and looked down into the shaft to see the cabin stalled just below him, faint light flickering from inside. Madison had already begun struggling to breathe. She fought to stay calm, gripping the handrail inside the cabin, but for the first time that night she truly understood that someone was hunting her, deliberately and without mercy. Connor could not risk restarting the elevator motor, since even the smallest spark might ignite the gas building up inside the shaft. Instead, he clipped a maintenance harness to the support cable and lowered himself down by hand, muscle memory from another life guiding every movement. As he closed in on the cabin, Jason quietly triggered the emergency release mechanism from a hidden access panel 2 floors below. The cabin lurched and began sliding downward without warning. Connor threw his weight against the steel frame and jammed a mechanical stop bar into the guide rail, locking the wheel just long enough to stop the fall before the cabin could reach the shaft below. He tore open a section of the cabin ceiling, pulled Madison up through the gap into the maintenance shaft, and guided her out onto the second-floor landing. When her legs gave out from exhaustion, he shielded her body as loose metal fragments rained down from the damaged elevator frame above. Once she had caught her breath, Madison apologized for humiliating him in front of the entire ballroom earlier that night. Connor told her the apology could wait, because whoever wanted her dead still controlled parts of the building's systems and was almost certainly still watching. Madison, still shaking, told him the upcoming audit was set to focus on a set of safety upgrade contracts worth $18 million, all of them personally approved by Jason. Connor finally understood the motive behind everything that had happened that night. Connor, Madison, and Amelia quietly worked out a plan to force Jason into revealing himself before he could cause any more damage. Madison returned to the ballroom and pretended nothing had changed, acting as though she still trusted Jason completely. In front of the remaining staff, she announced that a full backup of the audit data had already been secured on a server inside the old operations office, a detail she invented entirely for the moment. Connor guessed that Jason would try to destroy that supposed server before police could ever reach the building. He and Amelia positioned themselves near a backup camera system running on independent battery power, one that had not been connected to the compromised network and therefore could not be disabled remotely. Jason excused himself from the group, claiming he needed to help guide guests toward a safer part of the building, then slipped away down a service corridor toward the old operations office instead. The backup camera captured him using a cloned copy of Connor's access card to unlock the door. Inside the office, Jason found no server at all, only an empty desk and a single working lamp. Connor stepped out from the shadows and confronted him directly, the pretense finally over. Jason stopped pretending as well. He admitted, almost calmly, that he had spent years moving stolen funds through a network of shell companies, and that Madison's plan to bring in an independent auditor would have exposed every dollar of it within weeks. He revealed that his original plan had been simple: a small explosion in the kitchen that would kill Madison and burn every incriminating document along with her. Connor's early intervention had ruined that plan before it could even begin. Jason pulled a small remote control from his jacket and activated one final device, a second ignition source he had planted near the fuel tank of the hotel's backup generator. Connor lunged forward to wrestle the remote away, but Jason struck him across the shoulder with a length of metal pipe and bolted from the room, disappearing down the corridor before Connor could recover his footing. Madison had been listening the entire time through a hidden microphone Connor had planted earlier in the office, and every word of Jason's confession had been recorded. Before she could transmit the recording to the authorities outside, Jason cut power to the backup system from a junction box down the hall. A countdown timer on the remote control's receiver showed less than 4 minutes remaining. Amelia rushed into the office the moment she heard the confrontation, catching Connor as he steadied himself against the desk. Together they replayed the recording on Madison's device, confirming every word had been captured cleanly despite the severed connection, evidence that would matter regardless of what happened in the minutes ahead. Connor pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain spreading across his shoulder, and told Amelia they needed eyes on the basement generator room immediately, before Jason had any chance to finish what he started. There was no time left for caution, only for movement. Connor determined that the final device sat inside the generator room in the basement, and that if the fuel tank ignited, the fire would race up through the building's mechanical shafts and spread through every floor above. He told Madison to lead the remaining guests out through the east stairwell immediately. This time she did not argue or hesitate, moving quickly to follow his instructions without a single word of protest. Madison calmly organized the evacuation herself, prioritizing the elderly and the guests who had suffered minor injuries earlier in the chaos. The change in her was unmistakable, visible in the way she knelt beside a frightened waiter to help him steady his footing instead of simply barking orders from a distance. Connor and Amelia raced down to the generator room, only to find the heavy steel door had been locked from the outside, sealed by Jason before he fled. Connor forced his way through a narrow ventilation duct to reach the interior. Inside, the ignition device had been wired to the fuel tank using 3 cables of identical color, a deliberate trick meant to make any random cut catastrophically dangerous. Working by the sound of the relay clicking and the subtle warmth radiating from each wire, Connor identified the true trigger line hidden beneath a layer of insulation meant to disguise it from a hurried inspection. With only seconds left on the countdown, he chose not to cut the wire at all. Instead, he tore the entire ignition assembly free from the housing of the generator, severing its physical connection to the fuel tank before the timer could complete its cycle. The countdown reached 0. A small contained blast rang out inside the disconnected control box, but the fuel tank itself never ignited, and the flames Jason had planned for never came. Connor collapsed against the wall, choking on smoke and exhaustion, his body finally giving out after everything it had endured that night. Amelia pulled him clear of the room seconds before the automatic fire suppression system flooded the space with dense white foam. Outside the hotel, Madison watched as paramedics carried Connor out on a stretcher into the cold night air. Looking at him, she understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that the man she had once humiliated over a cold plate of food had placed his own life between danger and everyone else in that building 3 separate times before midnight had even arrived. She knelt beside the stretcher for a moment, ignoring the cameras already gathering near the entrance, and quietly told him that whatever came next, she intended to make certain the truth reached every person who had watched her humiliate him only hours earlier. Connor said nothing, too tired to speak, but the faint nod he gave her was answer enough for the moment. Jason attempted to escape the hotel grounds using a guest's parked car, but David Collins blocked the service gate, a small act of redemption after a night of cowardly mistakes. Police officers arrested Jason within minutes. The torn glove fragment, the cloned access card, the untouched backup camera footage, and the recorded confession together formed evidence far too strong to dispute. The investigation that followed uncovered that Jason had embezzled more than $18 million over several years, funneling the money through falsified safety contracts. His final plan had been to eliminate Madison, destroy the audit records, and let Connor take the blame for everything. David lost his job and faced his own investigation for falsifying safety documentation. Though he had never taken part in the plot to kill anyone, his negligence and his forged signatures had nearly cost hundreds of lives that night. Several days later, Madison held a press conference in the very ballroom where the crisis had unfolded. Standing before employees and many of the same guests who had watched her humiliate Connor, she chose to speak the truth openly rather than hide behind a prepared statement. She admitted that she had judged a man by his uniform instead of his character, that she had trusted a title more than the truth standing right in front of her, and that the pressure of her position had turned her, for one terrible moment, into someone who forgot to treat people with basic respect. Madison then offered Connor a new position, Director of Safety Systems for the entire Carter Hospitality Group, a role that would place him above every property the company owned. Connor did not accept immediately. He told her he would only take the job if every technician across the company received the authority to halt operations the moment they identified a genuine danger, without needing permission from anyone above them first. Madison agreed to the condition in front of the entire staff, making it clear the promise was not just a gesture, but a binding change in how the company would operate from that day forward. Amelia stood near the back of the ballroom as the announcement was made, remembering all the time she had watched Connor raise concerns that were dismissed without a second thought. For the first time in years, she felt certain that the culture inside the company was finally beginning to shift towards something better. Reporters pressed Madison afterward, asking whether the acquisition of the Grand Meridian would still move forward given everything that had happened. She answered without hesitation, telling them the deal would proceed exactly as planned, but only after every safety system in the building had been rebuilt under Connor's direct supervision, inspected personally rather than signed off on paper alone. 3 months later, Carter Hospitality Group completed a company-wide safety review under Connor's direct supervision, touching every property the business owned from top to bottom. Amelia was promoted to general manager of the Grand Meridian, and employees who had once been ignored now had a direct line to report risks without fear of punishment or dismissal. Connor continued living simply, his manner unchanged despite the new title attached to his name. His daughter was mentioned only briefly, in the quiet fact that he still left the office on time every evening that did not involve an emergency. One evening, Madison invited Connor to dinner at the very table where she had once shouted at him in front of hundreds of guests. There were no investors present, no reporters, and no board members watching from a distance, only two people who had seen the worst and the best of each other in a single night. When the food finally arrived, Madison waited a few deliberate minutes before smiling and asking whether dinner had gotten cold again. Connor answered that a cold meal could always be warmed back up, but trust once broken had to be rebuilt through action, not apology alone. Madison admitted quietly that she was still trying to do exactly that, one decision at a time. Connor studied her expression and recognized something genuine there, and he agreed to start again, not as chief executive and employee, but simply as two people willing to try. The evening ended as they left the restaurant together, side by side. Behind them, the plates on the table had gone cold once more, but this time neither of them gave it a second thought. Outside snow drifted quietly over the city streets, settling on the awning of the Grand Meridian the way it had every winter before this one. Connor paused for a moment beneath the light, thinking of his daughter waiting at home, of the promise he still kept every night that did not demand otherwise, and of how strange it felt to walk away from that building unafraid for the first time in months. Madison watched him for a moment before speaking again, telling him that the company would be dedicating a new safety training program to the technicians who had spent years being overlooked, the ones whose warnings had gone unheard long before that terrible night. She said his name would never appear on the program itself, because he had made it clear more than once that recognition mattered far less to him than the outcome it protected. Connor only nodded, accepting the plan the way he accepted most things, quietly and without ceremony. He had never needed his name printed anywhere to know the value of the work. As they walked toward the parking garage together, Madison admitted that she still thought often about the sound of the alarm that night, the way it had silenced a room full of people who, moments earlier, had been laughing at a man in a faded uniform. She said she hoped she would never forget that sound, or the lesson that came with it. Connor told her that some lessons were worth remembering exactly because they were uncomfortable, and that forgetting them was usually how people ended up repeating them. Madison agreed, and for the first time that evening, she looked less like a chief executive and more like a woman who had genuinely learned something about herself. They reached her car in silence, the city humming quietly around them, snow catching in the streetlights overhead. Madison thanked him again, this time without the weight of guilt behind the words, simply gratitude, plain and honest. Connor told her to get home safely, then turned and walked toward his own car parked near the far end of the garage, his shoulders a little lighter than they had been in a very long time. Behind him, the lights of the Grand Meridian glowed steadily against the dark winter sky, the building standing exactly as it always had, though everyone who worked inside it now understood something they had not understood before that night. Sometimes the person easiest to overlook is the one holding everything else together.